The existential wound. There exists within you a lie so perfectly constructed, so seamlessly integrated into the fabric of your daily existence, that questioning its validity feels like questioning your own sanity. This lie doesn't announce itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious deceptions. Instead, it whispers through your morning routines, guides your career choices, shapes your relationships, and determines the boundaries of what you believe possible for your life. It has masqueraded as wisdom for so long that you've forgotten it was ever anything else. You wake each morning and perform the rituals of this lie with such practiced precision that you've mistaken the performance for authenticity itself. Consider for a moment the possibility that everything you believe about your limitations, your personality, your capabilities, and your place in this world might be nothing more than an elaborate fiction you've been telling yourself since childhood. Not because you're weak or foolish, but because this fiction serves a purpose so fundamental to your psychological survival that abandoning it feels like stepping into an abyss. The human mind, in its desperate attempt to protect you from uncertainty and rejection, has constructed around you a prison so comfortable that you've decorated the walls and called it home. Schopenhauer once observed that most men lead lives of quiet desperation, but he failed to mention the most tragic part of this observation. The desperation isn't quiet because these men lack the courage to scream. It's quiet because they've convinced themselves that their cages are sanctuaries, that their limitations are wisdom, that their fears are prudence. They've become so skilled at rationalizing their imprisonment that they've forgotten they ever possessed keys. What I'm about to reveal to you over the next 45 minutes isn't another collection of motivational platitudes or self-help strategies designed to make you feel temporarily inspired. This is something far more dangerous and infinitely more valuable. This is an archaeological expedition into the deepest layers of your psychological conditioning, where we'll unearth the sophisticated mechanisms your own mind has developed to keep you small, safe, and perpetually unfulfilled. We'll examine 7 distinct manifestations of the central lie that governs your existence, each more subtle and destructive than the last. Jung warned us that the most terrifying thing isn't discovering that we're capable of evil, but discovering that we're capable of good. He understood that recognizing our true potential is more frightening than accepting our limitations because potential demands action, and action requires us to step beyond the carefully constructed boundaries of our familiar suffering. The lie I'm speaking of doesn't just limit what you do, it limits what you allow yourself to imagine, to want, to believe possible. It doesn't just affect your actions, it shapes the very landscape of your dreams. Tonight, you'll learn to recognize the architecture of your own self-sabotage. You'll see how your mind has convinced you that procrastination is preparation, that people-pleasing is kindness, that playing small is humility, and that avoiding risk is wisdom. You'll discover how the very qualities you've been taught to value, authenticity, humility, realism, and balance, have been weaponized against your own potential. But most importantly, you'll understand why recognizing this lie isn't just intellectually interesting, it's existentially urgent, because every day you remain unconscious of these patterns is another day stolen from the life you could be living. Every moment you spend negotiating with your limitations is a moment you're not spending actualizing your possibilities. The tragedy isn't that you're living below your potential. The tragedy is that you've become so skilled at justifying it that you've stopped noticing the loss. You've learned to mistake the absence of growth for the presence of peace, the avoidance of challenge for the achievement of wisdom. What we're about to undertake together isn't comfortable. It requires you to examine beliefs about yourself that you've held sacred for decades. It demands that you question not just what you do, but who you think you are. It asks you to consider the possibility that the person you've become might be nothing more than a collection of adaptive responses to threats that no longer exist. And perhaps most disturbing of all, it suggests that the life you're currently living might be nothing more than an elaborate strategy for avoiding the life you're actually capable of living. The choice before you is simple but not easy. You can close this video now, return to the familiar comfort of your well-rationalized limitations, and continue living the carefully managed life you've constructed. Your mind will help you forget these words. It's had decades of practice at protecting you from inconvenient truths. Or you can stay and discover what lies beyond the boundaries you've never questioned. But understand this, once you see the cage, you can never again pretend it's freedom. The parasite of false authenticity. The existential trap of living a constant performance. How modern social pressure teaches you that being yourself is a personal brand, not an interior discovery. There exists a parasite living inside your mind, and it feeds on the most precious thing you possess, your authenticity. This parasite didn't arrive yesterday, didn't suddenly appear in a midlife crisis, or on a particularly depressing Monday morning. It was carefully cultivated over decades, fed by every time you were rewarded for being who others expected you to be, and punished for expressing who you really were. Today, it's so much a part of you that you confuse its voice with your own, its desires with your own, its version of authenticity with the real thing. Modern society has turned being yourself into a commodity that can be bought, sold, and optimized. You've been taught that authenticity is something you build, not something you discover, that it's something you perform on social media, not something you live in the privacy of your room when nobody's watching. You've learned to curate your vulnerability so it appears genuine, to rehearse your spontaneity so it's convincing, to calculate your sincerity so it generates the desired impact. And the most disturbing part is that you do this so naturally you don't even notice you're doing it. The Jungian concept of persona versus the self, why Carl Jung warned that confusing your social mask with your true nature is the neurosis of the century. Carl Jung dedicated his life to understanding this fundamental division that exists within every human being. He identified that we carry with us at least two distinct identities: the persona, which is the social mask we use to navigate the world, and the self, which is our authentic psychological center, the core of our true nature. Jung didn't consider the persona as something negative or false in itself. He understood that we need social masks to function in society, to perform professional roles, to relate to different groups of people. The problem, he realized, arises when we lose the ability to distinguish between the mask and the face. Jung observed that people of his time, and this has intensified dramatically in ours, began to believe that they were their own masks. They identified so completely with the roles they played that they forgot something existed beneath the performance. The successful executive forgot he was once a curious child who liked to draw. The dedicated mother forgot there existed a woman with her own dreams before the children arrived. The brilliant intellectual forgot there's a simple person who just wants to be loved underneath all the sophisticated theories. This confusion between persona and self became, in Jung's words, the neurosis of our time. Because when you no longer know who you are without your masks, when you can no longer access your authentic nature without the mediation of social roles, you develop a profound existential anxiety. You feel like you're living someone else's life, but you can't identify exactly whose. You feel like an actor who's been on stage so long that he's forgotten how to step out of character. Counterintuitive revelation. The authenticity you seek may be just another sophisticated disguise, when the ego hijacks even the search for authenticity. Here we arrive at the most disturbing point of this first revelation. The human ego is so cunning, so sophisticated in its self-preservation mechanisms, that it can hijack even your search for authenticity and turn it into yet another performance. You might be performing authenticity the same way you once performed success, or conformity or rebellion. The difference is that now the performance is more subtle, more convincing, and even more dangerous because you genuinely believe you've finally found your true self. Observe how this works in practice. You discovered that vulnerability generates connection, so you started sharing your struggles in a calculated way. You learned that people respect those who do the inner work, so you began talking about therapy, meditation, and personal growth in a way that signals your spiritual evolution. You realized that authenticity is valued in the workplace, so you developed an authentic personal brand that communicates your values and your uniqueness. None of this is necessarily problematic until you realize you're doing it. The problem arises when you lose the ability to distinguish between authentically expressing who you are and strategically performing who you think you should be. When your search for authenticity becomes another way to impress others, another way to gain approval, another strategy to feel special and important, the ego manages to corrupt even the purest impulses because its primary function is to protect you from rejection and abandonment. So it takes your legitimate need to be seen and known and transforms it into a more sophisticated version of the same need for approval you've always had. The difference is that now the approval you seek is for your authenticity, not for your conformity. Practical exercise in deconstructing false personality. How to identify which aspects of you are genuine and which are defensive constructions. The only way to begin separating what is authentically yours from what is adaptive performance is to develop the capacity to observe yourself without judgment. This requires a level of honesty with yourself that may be initially uncomfortable, but is absolutely necessary for any real growth. Over the next few weeks, before each significant social interaction, ask yourself a simple but powerful question. What am I trying to prove right now? Observe how different environments activate different versions of you. Pay attention to how your voice changes when you talk to your boss versus when you talk to your parents versus when you talk to your intimate friends. Notice how your opinions become flexible depending on who's listening. Observe how you emphasize different aspects of your personality depending on what kind of reaction you want to provoke. Don't judge these observations. Simply notice them. Then, when you're alone, ask yourself, what would I do if nobody were watching and there were no consequences? This question reveals the distance between your authentic expression and your performative expression. The greater the difference between these two answers, the greater the control the parasite of false authenticity has over your life. Notice which aspects of your personality emerge only when you're trying to impress someone, and which aspects you suppress because they don't fit the image you want to project. The metaphor of the actor who forgot he was acting, how Nietzsche described modern man trapped in his own fictions. Nietzsche captured this human condition with a metaphor that remains hauntingly relevant more than a century later. He described modern man as an actor who has been on stage for so long that he forgot he was acting. The actor identified so completely with his character that he lost access to the person who existed before the role began. He can no longer exit the character because he no longer remembers who he was when he wasn't performing. This is the situation most of us find ourselves in. You've been playing the roles of the obedient child, the dedicated employee, the understanding partner, the successful person for so long that these roles have merged with your identity. You can no longer imagine who you would be without these behavioral scripts because they've become the very substance of your self-perception. The tragedy isn't that you're performing. We all need social masks to navigate the complexity of modern life. The tragedy is that you've lost the ability to take off the masks when you get home. Nietzsche saw this condition as a form of death in life. When you can no longer access your authentic nature, when all your thoughts, feelings, and actions are mediated by considerations of how you should be, you stop living and merely start representing a life. You become a fiction so convincing that even you believe it. But underneath the sophisticated performance exists a void where your true personality used to be. The path back from this condition requires courage to question not just what you do, but who you think you are. It requires the willingness to sit with the uncomfortable possibility that much of what you consider your personality might be nothing more than a collection of adaptive responses you developed to survive in environments that no longer exist. And most importantly, it requires the courage to discover who you might be when you stop trying to be who you think you should be. The invisible tyranny of unconscious consent, the silent pain of living under external approval, how you developed an addictive dependency on others' validation without realizing it. There's a drug circulating through your nervous system at this exact moment, a substance so addictive that you've organized your entire life around obtaining it. This drug has no name in pharmacies, isn't sold on street corners, doesn't leave visible marks on your body, but it controls your decisions with more power than any chemical substance ever could. This drug is external approval, and you've developed such a deep dependency that you don't even notice when you're under its influence. The addiction started early, long before you had sufficient consciousness to question it. Every smile you earned by being good, every compliment you received for behaving appropriately, every moment of acceptance you experienced by suppressing inconvenient parts of your personality was a dose of this drug entering your system. Gradually, without you realizing it, your brain learned to associate approval with safety, validation with self-worth, social acceptance with basic survival. Now, decades later, you can no longer make an important decision without consulting this invisible committee of voices in your head. Before choosing a career, you wonder what your parents will think. Before expressing an opinion, you calculate how it will be received. Before making a significant change in your life, you imagine the reactions of people around you. You've become a psychological hostage to people who may not even be paying attention to you, a prisoner of judgments that may not even exist. The most insidious part of this dependency is how it disguises itself as virtue. You've called your need for approval, consideration for others. You've transformed your inability to say no into generosity. You've converted your fear of rejection into humility. You've taken your psychological prison and decorated it with beautiful words until it looked like a moral palace. But underneath all these noble rationalizations, you know something is wrong. You feel the constant weight of living for an audience that never stops watching, never stops judging, never stops demanding that you be different from what you naturally are. The Freudian mechanism of introjection, how critical voices from authority figures became your own inner voice. Sigmund Freud identified one of the most devastating psychological processes that shape human personality: introjection. This mechanism describes how external voices become internal voices, how others' criticisms transform into self-criticism, how alien judgments metamorphose into your own judgments. What Freud discovered is that it's not just the words that get internalized, but the critics themselves. You don't just remember the negative things they said about you. You carry the people who said them living permanently in your mind. Think about the most powerful critical voice that exists in your head right now. That voice that tells you you're not good enough, that questions your decisions, that anticipates the worst in every situation. Observe the tone of that voice, the language it uses, the way it structures its criticisms. If you pay sufficient attention, you'll begin to recognize that this voice isn't originally yours. It's the voice of the demanding father who was never satisfied with your grades. It's the voice of the anxious mother who always anticipated catastrophes. It's the voice of the sarcastic teacher who ridiculed your questions. It's the voice of the critical partner who always found flaws in what you did. These voices installed themselves in your psychological system when you were young and vulnerable, when your identity was still being formed, and you desperately needed approval to feel safe in the world. You internalized not just their words, but their entire perspectives, their value systems, their fears, and their limitations. And now, decades later, these voices continue operating as if they were your own opinions, influencing every important decision you make. The result is a peculiar form of psychological schizophrenia, where multiple critical personalities compete for your attention, each demanding that you behave according to their specific expectations. You've become an internal parliament of conflicting voices, some demanding perfection, others demanding safety, some preaching caution, others insisting on conformity. And in the midst of this psychological cacophony, your authentic voice, if it still exists, was silenced so long ago that you don't even remember how it sounded. Paradigm break. You don't seek approval because of insecurity, but because of a primitive survival program that still believes social rejection equals death. Here we arrive at the revelation that can fundamentally change how you understand your own need for approval. You don't seek external validation because you're weak, insecure, or needy. You seek approval because your primitive nervous structure still operates as if you lived in small hunter-gatherer tribes 10,000 years ago, where being rejected by the group meant certain death in the wilderness. During most of human evolution, our survival absolutely depended on acceptance by the social group. If you were expelled from the tribe, you would die alone, without resources, without protection, without possibility of reproduction. Our brains developed an ultra-sensitive alarm system to detect signs of social rejection, and this system was calibrated to prefer 1,000 false alarms to missing one real danger. It was better to be paranoid about social acceptance and survive than to be relaxed and die abandoned. The problem is that this alarm system was never updated for modern reality. Your amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for detecting threats, still reacts to an ugly look from your boss as if it were a death sentence. Your nervous system still interprets social criticism as existential threat. Your physiology still produces the same stress hormones when you're socially rejected that it would produce if you were being chased by a predator. This understanding changes everything because it means your need for approval isn't a character flaw. It's a survival program functioning exactly as it was designed, just in an environment for which it wasn't calibrated. When you understand this, you can begin to see your social anxiety, your need to please, and your difficulty confronting others not as signs of personal weakness, but as evidence of a hyperactive protection system trying to keep you alive in a world that no longer exists. 3-step technique for identifying and breaking submissive behavioral patterns, based on the psychology of individuation. The process of freeing yourself from this invisible tyranny begins with developing a capacity few humans possess: the ability to observe your own behavioral patterns in real time, without judgment, but with growing awareness. Carl Jung called this process individuation, the gradual development of the capacity to function as an autonomous individual, instead of just as a collection of conditioned responses to others. The first step involves learning to identify when you're operating in approval mode. This requires developing sensitivity to the physical and emotional signals that accompany this mental state. When you're about to make a decision based on what others will think, your body often signals this shift before your conscious mind realizes it. You might notice tension in your chest, an empty feeling in your stomach, a tightness in your throat, or a different quality in your breathing. These are signs that you've switched from autonomous mode to approval mode. The second step involves consciously pausing when you identify these signals and asking yourself a simple but profound question: whose voice is speaking in my head right now? Often you'll discover that the anxiety about a decision isn't coming from the current situation, but from an internalized voice of someone from your past. It might be your mother's worry, your father's perfectionism, a sibling's competitiveness, or an ex-partner's judgment. Identifying the origin of the voice is crucial because it allows you to begin separating your own values and preferences from the internalized expectations of other people. The third step is the most challenging and involves consciously making a decision based on your own internal compass, even when this generates social discomfort or disapproval. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or insensitive to others, but rather learning to distinguish between genuine consideration for others and neurotic compulsion for approval. It means consciously choosing when you want to consider other people's opinions because they're relevant and useful, versus when you're being controlled by them through automatic fear of rejection. Plato's allegory of the cave applied to modern conformism, how most people prefer familiar shadows to the disturbing light of truth. Plato offered us one of the most powerful metaphors for understanding why it's so difficult to escape the need for social approval. In the allegory of the cave, he described prisoners chained since birth, forced to look only at a wall where they see shadows projected by objects behind them. These prisoners mistake the shadows for reality because it's all they know. When a prisoner is freed and sees the real world for the first time, the experience is so uncomfortable and disorienting that he often prefers to return to the familiar cave. Your need for approval functions like those Platonic chains. You were conditioned from childhood to look at the shadows, other people's reactions and opinions, and assume that these shadows were reality about your own worth. You learned to interpret approval as evidence that you were good, and disapproval as evidence that something was wrong with you. You built your entire identity based on these projected shadows, without ever questioning whether they really represented something real about who you are. The process of individuation is like being freed from this psychological cave. When you begin to question the authority of these internalized voices, when you begin to make decisions based on your own values instead of others' expectations, you're essentially turning your back on the familiar shadows and walking toward the light. But just as in Plato's allegory, this initial light is uncomfortable, even painful. Your eyes, accustomed to the darkness of dependency, need time to adjust to the reality of autonomy. And here's the most disturbing part of the metaphor. When you return to try to free other prisoners, they often resist. They attack you for questioning the reality of the shadows. They prefer the familiarity of the prison to the uncertainty of freedom. Similarly, when you stop constantly seeking approval and begin living according to your own values, some people around you may feel threatened. Your psychological freedom mirrors their imprisonment, and this can generate hostility or attempts to pull you back into the familiar pattern of mutual dependency on validation. The trap of infinite preparation. The existential block of disguised perfectionism, when preparing better, becomes a golden prison that prevents real action. There exists a form of procrastination so sophisticated, so intellectually respectable, that you can spend decades practicing it without ever suspecting you're sabotaging your own life. This form of self-sabotage doesn't look like traditional laziness. It doesn't involve watching television when you should be working or postponing tasks out of pure indiscipline. This is a much more dangerous form of procrastination because it disguises itself as virtue, as responsibility, as practical wisdom. You've developed an obsession with preparation that has completely transcended the real need for preparation. You always need one more course before starting, one more book before applying, one more research before deciding, one more plan before acting. You've transformed preparation into an end in itself, into an activity that generates the illusion of progress, without ever requiring you to expose yourself to the real risk of failing while trying something important. The most insidious part of this trap is how it feeds your ego in ways that real action never could. When you're preparing, you feel intelligent, prudent, responsible. You can impress others with the depth of your research, the sophistication of your planning, the meticulousness of your approach. But all of this is intellectual masturbation disguised as productive work. You're giving yourself mental pleasure without ever having to face the real vulnerability that comes from putting your ideas into the world and discovering what actually happens when theory meets reality. The concept of analysis paralysis in cognitive psychology, how excess information can sabotage decision-making. Cognitive psychology has identified that there's a crucial inflection point in the decision-making process. Initially, more information improves the quality of decisions, but after a certain point, additional information begins to degrade the ability to decide. This phenomenon is known as analysis paralysis, and it explains why highly intelligent people often become incapable of acting in situations that require practical decisions. Your brain evolved to process limited amounts of information before making survival decisions. In the wild, our ancestors had to quickly decide whether to fight, flee, or hide. Those who spent too much time analyzing all the variables were eaten by predators. But in the modern world, you have access to virtually unlimited information about any decision you need to make, and your primitive brain doesn't know how to handle this abundance. The result is that you become overwhelmed by possibilities, paralyzed by variables, incapacitated by options. The more you research, the more complex the problem seems. The more you analyze, the more risks you identify. The more you plan, the more you realize what you don't know. And so you get stuck in an infinite loop of information gathering that never results in real action, because there's always one more thing you should consider, one more angle you should explore, one more scenario you should plan for. Shocking revelation. Your search for more knowledge may be terror disguised as wisdom, the fear of discovering your real limits. Here we arrive at the psychological core of this fourth lie. Your compulsive need to prepare more isn't evidence that you're especially conscious or responsible. It's evidence that you're terrified of discovering what your real limits are. It's more comfortable to live in the fantasy of unlimited potential that you maintain while preparing than to face the reality of your actual limits that would be revealed if you really tried something important. When you're in the preparation phase, you can imagine any level of success. You can fantasize about perfect performance, extraordinary results, universal recognition. All scenarios remain possible while you're not testing any of them in reality. But the moment you act, the moment you put your ideas into the real world, you discover exactly where the gap is between your fantasies and your current capabilities. This shouldn't be frightening. It should be liberating, because only when you know your real limits can you begin to expand them. Only when you know where you are can you chart a path to where you want to go. But your ego prefers the grandiose uncertainty of infinite preparation to the humble clarity that comes from trying and discovering what happens. It prefers maintaining the illusion of untested competence to facing the reality of competence in development. Practical exercise in imperfect action. How to implement the Stoic concept of preferred indifference in modern life. The Stoic philosophers developed a profoundly liberating concept called preferred indifference. They classified most of the things we worry about, perfect conditions, complete preparation, guarantees of success, as preferred indifference. They're nice to have, but they're not necessary for a well-lived life. More importantly, they're not necessary for virtuous action. Marcus Aurelius governed the greatest empire in history without perfect conditions. He made decisions affecting millions of people with incomplete information. He acted in circumstances of war, plague, and political chaos without having time for infinite preparation. And he did all this not because he was imprudent, but because he understood that life rarely offers ideal conditions for important action. The Stoic practice of imperfect action involves deliberately taking meaningful action before feeling completely prepared. It involves accepting that your first attempts will be imperfect and using that imperfection as information for improvement, not as evidence that you should have waited longer. It involves understanding that competence develops through iterative practice, not through infinite theoretical preparation. The Zen Archer's parable, why mastery comes through practice, not infinite theoretical study. An ancient Zen parable tells the story of a student who spent years studying all the texts on archery, memorizing all the techniques, analyzing all the theoretical aspects of the practice. When he finally picked up a bow for the first time, He missed every target. Frustrated, he sought out a Zen master and asked why his theoretical knowledge hadn't translated into practical skill. The master replied, "You studied archery, but you never practiced being an archer. Knowledge about something isn't the same thing as skill at doing something. An archer becomes an archer by shooting arrows, missing targets, adjusting aim, shooting again. Competence emerges from repetition, not from contemplation." This parable perfectly captures why infinite preparation not only fails to create real competence, it actively prevents the development of real competence. When you get stuck in the theoretical study of something, you develop the illusion that you understand without developing the capacity to execute. You confuse conceptual familiarity with practical skill, and the more time you spend in the theoretical phase, the more intimidating the transition to real practice becomes, because the gap between your theoretical knowledge and your current practical ability becomes increasingly obvious and embarrassing. Real mastery, whether in archery, business, relationships, or any other area of life, emerges through the cycle of attempt, error, adjustment, and repetition. Each failure provides specific information that no amount of theoretical study could provide. Each success builds real confidence based on demonstrated competence, not imagined competence. The only way to become good at something is to start by being bad at it, and persist through the uncomfortable but necessary phase of developing real skill. The internal tyrant of false humility. The narcissistic wound disguised as modesty. How false humility can be inverted pride and fear of responsibility. There exists a form of narcissism so sophisticated, so well disguised as virtue, that you can spend your entire life practicing it while congratulating yourself on your humility. This isn't the obvious arrogance we easily recognize: blatant exhibitionism, desperate attention-seeking, compulsive need to brag. This is a much more subtle and dangerous form of inflated ego that hides behind a mask of modesty, self-deprecation, and false humility. You've developed a toxic relationship with yourself, where publicly diminishing yourself has become a way of controlling how others perceive you. "I'm not good at this. I don't deserve this. Other people are much better than me. I don't have talent for this." These phrases seem like evidence of genuine humility, but they're often unconscious strategies for avoiding responsibility, managing expectations, and maintaining control over social interactions. False humility operates at an even deeper level than this. It allows you to maintain a grandiose self-image while avoiding the real work necessary to justify that grandeur. When you say, "I don't deserve this," you're implicitly assuming that other people haven't perceived your true qualities. When you insist you're not good at something, you're protecting yourself from the possibility of really trying and discovering your actual limits. False humility is narcissism using modesty as a shield against the vulnerability of genuine attempt. Machiavelli and the concept of virtù, why hiding your talents isn't virtue, but social cowardice. Niccolò Machiavelli developed a concept he called virtù, a word that has no exact translation into English, but which involves the courage to exercise your real capabilities when the situation demands it. For Machiavelli, virtù wasn't about being morally perfect according to conventional standards, but about having the inner strength to act decisively when action was necessary, regardless of how it might make you look to others. Machiavelli observed that many people confuse moral virtue with practical virtue. They think being a good person means being harmless, invisible, always willing to put themselves in second place. But Machiavelli argued that this form of passive goodness often allows evil to prosper, through lack of effective opposition. When capable people refuse to exercise their capacities because it wouldn't seem humble, they're essentially abandoning their responsibilities in favor of a comfortable social image. The concept of virtù suggests that hiding your talents isn't modesty, it's cowardice disguised as virtue. When you have skills that could benefit others but choose not to develop or apply them, because it would make you seem arrogant, you're prioritizing your emotional comfort zone over your social responsibility. You're choosing the safety of irrelevance over the risk of relevance. Radical inversion. "I don't deserve" may be a sophisticated form of avoiding the work necessary to deserve. This revelation will cut deep because it attacks one of the most respectable forms of self-sabotage that exists. When you say, "I don't deserve this," you're often avoiding the more important question: what would I need to do to deserve this? The language of deservingness allows you to treat competence as if it were a gift from the universe, instead of the result of sustained effort and deliberate development. "I don't deserve" also functions as a sophisticated form of spiritual laziness. It's easier to accept the idea that you're fundamentally inadequate than to do the work necessary to become adequate. It's more comfortable to assume that other people have natural gifts you don't have than to face the possibility that they simply worked harder, risked more, persisted longer through difficulties you weren't willing to face. The language of deservingness also allows you to maintain a secret fantasy of unrecognized greatness. When you insist you don't deserve something good that happened to you, you're implicitly assuming that you really should deserve it, but that the world simply hasn't noticed your inherent qualities. This is an extremely sophisticated form of narcissism. You maintain an inflated self-image while avoiding any real test of that image. Technique for recognizing and honoring your own gifts. Based on Bandura's self-efficacy psychology, Albert Bandura discovered that belief in your capacity to achieve something is often more important for success than your actual current skill level. He called this self-efficacy, your assessment of your own competence to execute behaviors necessary to produce specific attainments. People with high self-efficacy tend to set more challenging goals and persist longer when facing obstacles. The development of real self-efficacy requires that you learn to honestly recognize your current capabilities without inflation or deflation. This means stopping the use of self-deprecating language as a form of social modesty and beginning to make accurate assessments of your strengths and weaknesses. It means recognizing that you have certain developed skills, certain areas of knowledge, certain experiences that other people don't have, and that denying this isn't humility, it's dishonesty. The process involves documenting concrete evidence of your competencies. When you notice you're naturally good at something, instead of deflecting with, "It was luck," or "anyone would do that," you consciously acknowledge, "I have skill in this, and I can develop it further." When someone compliments you for something you did well, instead of automatically minimizing with, "It was nothing," you practice simply saying, "Thank you," and allowing the recognition to be absorbed. The metaphor of the gardener who buries the seeds, how wasting potential is a form of violence against life. Imagine a gardener who plants seeds in fertile soil, but then buries them so deeply that they can never sprout. The seeds have inherent potential to become plants that could feed people, beautify spaces, produce oxygen, shelter wildlife. But this potential is wasted not because of lack of inherent capacity, but because of misdirected action by the gardener himself. This metaphor captures exactly what happens when you use false humility to bury your own talents. You weren't born without gifts. You learned to hide them so deeply they can't express themselves in the world. You developed such sophisticated self-deprecation skills that your real talents suffocate from lack of exercise and recognition. The waste of human potential isn't just a personal tragedy, it's a form of violence against the fabric of life. When you refuse to develop and express your unique capacities, you're depriving the world of contributions that only you could make. You're denying other people the benefit of your gifts, the solutions you could create, the inspiration you could offer, the problems you could solve. True humility doesn't involve denying your capacities. It involves honoring them by developing them to the fullest and using them in service of something greater than yourself. Authentic humility recognizes that your talents weren't created by you, but that you have the responsibility to cultivate them and apply them in ways that benefit not just you, but the larger community of which you're a part. The temporal illusion of the future self. The existential anguish of chronic procrastination. How you created a mythical future self who will never arrive. Within your mind exists one of the most elaborate and destructive fictions the human psyche has ever developed. The belief in a future self who will be fundamentally different from the present self. This mythical character you've created possesses all the qualities you feel you lack today. More discipline, more courage, more motivation, more clarity, more energy. He lives in an imaginary time when conditions will be perfect, when obstacles will have disappeared, when you'll finally have everything you need to start living the life you really want. This isn't ordinary procrastination, that obvious form of delay we recognize when we choose entertainment over important work. This is a much more sophisticated form of temporal escape where you constantly negotiate present responsibilities with future promises. Tomorrow I'll start. Next week I'll get organized. After vacation I'll focus. Next year I'll change. Each of these promises is a contract signed with a version of you that doesn't exist and never will exist. The future self functions as a psychological escape valve. that allows you to maintain the illusion that you're committed to change without ever having to face the real discomfort of changing. It offers immediate relief from the pressure to act today, while preserving your self-image as someone who will do something about your situation. It's a brilliant form of self-deception because it allows you to feel virtuous about future intentions while completely avoiding present responsibility. Heidegger and the concept of being toward death, how denial of finitude creates the illusion of infinite time. Martin Heidegger identified one of the most fundamental characteristics of authentic human existence, what he called being toward death. Heidegger argued that genuine awareness of our own mortality is what allows us to live with authenticity and appropriate urgency. When you truly understand that your existence is finite, each moment becomes precious, each decision becomes significant, each day becomes a unique opportunity that will never return. But most people, Heidegger observed, live in constant denial of their own finitude. They function as if they had infinite time, as if there would always be later to do what really matters, as if death were something that happens to other people or on a date so distant in the future that it doesn't merit present consideration. This denial of mortality creates what Heidegger called inauthentic existence, a form of living that avoids confronting the most fundamental questions of the human condition. The illusion of infinite time is precisely what feeds your dependence on the mythical future self. When you subconsciously believe you have indefinite decades ahead, postponing important decisions seems reasonable. When you operate as if you were immortal, urgency disappears. When you deny the reality that each passing day is one less day in your total existence, procrastination becomes not just possible, but psychologically comfortable, devastating discovery. The tomorrow you promise yourself is a psychological fiction that kills the only real moment, the present. Here we arrive at the core of this sixth lie, and it's devastating because it destroys the very foundation on which you've built your life strategies. The tomorrow that you constantly promise yourself doesn't exist. It never existed and never will exist. There's only today transforming into yesterday, and a new today appearing where you thought tomorrow would be. When tomorrow arrives, it will be experienced as today, with all the same limitations, distractions, and resistance you feel today. The future self to whom you constantly delegate responsibilities is a psychological projection, a comforting fantasy that allows you to avoid the anxiety of acting in the only moment where action is really possible. When you promise to start the diet on Monday, when you plan to begin the project after the weekend, when you decide you'll change your life next month, you're essentially transferring responsibility to a person who doesn't exist. This temporal transfer of responsibility functions like a psychological drug. It offers immediate relief from the pressure of change while preserving the illusion that change will still happen. But each time you do this, you kill a little bit of the present moment. You transform today, the only place where life really happens, into a waiting period for an imaginary future where you'll finally be who you think you should be. The cruel reality is that you'll never meet the future self because when the future arrives, it always arrives as the present. And in the present, you'll always be you, with the same fears, the same resistance, the same mental patterns you have today. The only difference will be that you'll have wasted more time waiting for a magical transformation that never happened. Practice of existential urgency. How to use awareness of mortality as fuel for immediate action. Liberation from this temporal illusion requires that you develop what we can call existential urgency, a visceral, not just intellectual, awareness that your time is limited and constantly diminishing. This doesn't mean living in panic or anxiety about death, but rather allowing the reality of finitude to inform your priorities and accelerate your willingness to act. Begin each day with a simple but profound reminder. This day will never return. The hours you have today are part of a finite supply that's constantly decreasing. Each moment you spend postponing important action is a moment you'll never recover, regardless of what you achieve in the future. This isn't a morbid reflection. It's a realistic calibration that allows you to treat your time with the respect it deserves. Awareness of mortality should function as fuel, not paralysis. When you truly internalize that you have a limited number of days remaining, procrastination becomes not just imprudent but painful. The idea of wasting precious time waiting for perfect conditions or future motivation becomes intolerable. Existential urgency transforms "I should do this" into "I need to do this now," because now is all you really have. Marcus Aurelius and the Meditations. Why the Stoics meditated on death not to depress, but to live with intensity. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome and Stoic philosopher, developed a practice that might seem morbid to modern mentalities, but which was profoundly liberating. He meditated daily on death. Not his own death specifically, but on the universal reality of mortality and the brevity of human existence. He did this not to become depressed or create anxiety, but to live with greater intensity and clarity. In his Meditations, Aurelius wrote, "It is not death that a man should fear, but never beginning to live." He understood that awareness of mortality shouldn't paralyze but liberate. When you completely accept that your life is temporary, you stop treating it as if it were a draft. You stop waiting for the real version of your life to begin and start living intensely the life you have now. The Stoics practiced what they called memento mori, remembrance of death, not as an exercise in pessimism, but as a focusing technique. They knew that humans have a natural tendency to procrastinate, to postpone what's important, to live as if they had infinite time. Regular meditation on mortality functioned as an antidote against this natural tendency, creating appropriate urgency for important decisions and actions. When you seriously contemplate your own mortality, priorities clarify instantly. Things that seemed important reveal their triviality. Fears that seemed paralyzing reveal their insignificance compared to the fear of wasting your one life. The energy you spent maintaining illusions about infinite time becomes available for real action in the limited time you actually have. The kidnapping of will by comfort. The golden prison of the comfort zone. How modern well-being can be a subtle form of death in life. We arrive at the final and perhaps most insidious lie of all, the belief that comfort equals success, that ease equals wisdom, that avoiding discomfort equals living well. You've been conditioned by modern society to believe that the supreme goal of human existence is to minimize pain, maximize pleasure, and create a state of perpetual balance where nothing disturbs your mental peace. This life philosophy seems not just sensible but virtuous. After all, who doesn't want to live with less stress, less conflict, less uncertainty? But here's a truth that will disturb you. Excessive comfort can be a sophisticated form of spiritual death. When you optimize your life to eliminate all unnecessary discomfort, you also eliminate the conditions that allow real growth. When you build routines so predictable that you're never challenged, you create an existence so safe it becomes insignificant. When you systematically avoid situations that could generate anxiety, conflict, or uncertainty, you're not preserving your peace. You're slowly suffocating your vitality. The comfort zone functions like a subtle psychological drug. It offers immediate relief from tension, but with a devastating side effect. It progressively reduces your tolerance for any form of discomfort. The more time you spend in controlled environments, predictable relationships, and familiar routines, the smaller your capacity becomes to deal with change, growth, or adventure. You become like a muscle that isn't exercised, technically functional, but increasingly weak and incapable of responding when life demands real strength. Nietzsche and the will to power. Why avoiding necessary suffering is avoiding essential growth. Friedrich Nietzsche identified that all healthy life is driven by something he called will to power. Not power over others, but power to become more than you currently are. This inherent vital force constantly seeks expansion, growth, overcoming of current limitations. It doesn't seek comfort. It seeks fulfillment. It doesn't avoid challenges. It embraces them as opportunities to strengthen itself. It doesn't minimize suffering. It transforms suffering into wisdom, strength, and increased capacity. Nietzsche observed that modern culture was developing what he called slave morality, a philosophy of life based on avoiding pain instead of seeking greatness. This mentality treats suffering as always negative, discomfort as always avoidable, and ease as always desirable. But Nietzsche argued that this approach to life produces progressively weaker, less capable, less vital human beings. The will to power recognizes that a certain type of suffering is not just inevitable, but necessary for any significant growth. The athlete embraces the pain of training because he knows muscles grow only when challenged beyond their current capacity. The artist accepts the frustration of imperfection because he knows skill develops only through repeated attempts and instructive failures. The entrepreneur tolerates the uncertainty of risk because he knows absolute safety is incompatible with real innovation. Final revelation. Your search for balance may be a disguised refusal of the intensity that life demands from you. This revelation will challenge one of the most venerated beliefs of contemporary culture, the idea that balance is always virtuous and that intensity is always harmful. You've been taught that a well-lived life is characterized by moderation in all things, by avoiding extremes, by keeping all areas of life in perfect harmony. But this search for balance may be a sophisticated form of avoiding the type of intensity and focus that significant achievements always require. Consider any person who has ever achieved something extraordinary in any field: art, science, business, sports, human relations. Their lives rarely exemplify balance in the conventional sense. They're characterized by periods of intense focus, consuming passion, dedication that transcends concerns with personal comfort. They sacrificed balance in favor of excellence in areas they considered more important than their own tranquility. The modern obsession with balance may be a culturally sanctioned form of mediocrity. When you insist that all areas of your life must receive equal attention, you guarantee that no area will receive the intensity of focus necessary for exceptional results. When you avoid any commitment that might disturb your current balance, you avoid exactly the types of commitments that could lead to transformative growth. Method of voluntary discomfort: how to use small doses of adversity to strengthen the will. Liberation from this seventh lie requires that you develop a completely different relationship with discomfort. Instead of treating it as something always avoidable, you need to learn to see it as a strengthening tool. Instead of fleeing from challenging situations, you need to systematically develop them as a way of expanding your capacity to deal with real life. Voluntary discomfort functions like psychological vaccination, controlled exposure to small doses of adversity to develop immunity to larger forms of difficulty. This can include deliberate physical challenges like intense exercise, cold showers, or occasional fasting. It can involve social challenges like initiating conversations with strangers, expressing unpopular opinions, or confronting conflicts instead of avoiding them. It can include intellectual challenges like studying difficult subjects, questioning comfortable beliefs, or engaging with ideas that challenge your current worldview. The goal isn't masochism or unnecessary suffering, but deliberate development of resilience, willpower, and capacity to function effectively, even when conditions aren't ideal. Each time you voluntarily choose the harder path when the easier path is available, you strengthen your capacity to choose growth over comfort when crucial moments require that choice. The myth of Prometheus, why stealing fire from the gods, leaving the comfort zone, always demands a price but is what makes us human. The Greek myth of Prometheus offers one of the most powerful metaphors for understanding why growth always requires you to leave the comfort zone and accept uncomfortable consequences. Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to human beings, knowing he would be punished eternally for this act. The gods chained him to a rock where an eagle would eat his liver every day for all eternity. But here's what we often miss in this story. Prometheus consciously chose the suffering. He knew what the price would be for giving fire to humanity, and he decided it was worth paying that price. He chose meaning over safety, impact over comfort, transformation of the human condition over preservation of his own tranquility. This is the essence of authentic human condition, the capacity and responsibility to choose growth that benefits not just you, but others, even when that growth requires significant personal sacrifice. When you always choose the path of least resistance, when you always prioritize your comfort over greater possibilities, you abdicate the very characteristic that defines mature humanity. Life doesn't want balance, it wants expression, expansion, realization of potential. It wants you to steal fire from the gods even knowing there will be consequences. Because it's precisely in the willingness to pay the price of growth that you become fully human, fully alive, fully worthy of the extraordinary existence available to those brave enough to leave the comfort zone and enter the zone of possibility, the awakening. We've reached the end of this journey through the 7 disguises of the central lie that has governed your life. You've seen how the search for authenticity can become just another performance, how the need for approval can imprison your will, how intellectual victimization can mask flight from responsibility, how infinite preparation can avoid real action, how false humility can waste your potential, how temporal illusion can steal your present, and how excessive comfort can suffocate your vitality. The question now isn't whether these lies exist in your life. They do. The question is what you'll do with this knowledge. You can close this video, return to your familiar routines, and allow your mind to gradually erase the discomfort of these revelations. Or you can use this moment as a starting point for a completely different form of existing. Real awakening doesn't happen when you intellectually understand these patterns. It happens when you begin interrupting them in real life. When you stop in the middle of an unnecessary explanation and choose silence. When you act today instead of promising action tomorrow. When you accept necessary discomfort instead of automatically avoiding it. When you honor your gifts instead of burying them in false modesty. The life you've always known was possible is waiting on the other side of these 7 lies. But it requires you to abandon the version of yourself that has been kept alive by these comfortable illusions. The choice, as always, is entirely yours. What if your discomfort with mediocrity isn't a problem to solve, but a signal to follow? What if your restlessness isn't something to medicate, but something to honor? What if the very thing that makes you feel like you don't belong is exactly what the world needs? The choice, as always, is yours.